I need some help understanding something. Here are two different scenarios. In the first, a studio announces two games in 2006. The new console generation has just begun, and the studio shows off not one, but two new games for the new machines. Both are brand new entries in a beloved franchise, with one being the next numbered installment and the other being a dark and more modern take on the series. 3 years later, we're in 2009 now, the main entry is released. It's beautiful to look at, but apparently the development process was hell, and the critical and fan reception is less than stellar. As for the darker spin off, there's a few whispers here and there, but there's very little concrete information to go off on. 2 years later, still, we're in 2011 now, the studio releases a sequel to the main entry, a sequel that wasn't too intensely anticipated, and it too was received with a mostly tepid response. The darker spin-off gets a slick new trailer this year, but at this point the anticipation had kind of relaxed a bit since there still wasn't a solid release window, and the quality of the now two games that had been released, they just weren't setting the world on fire. Yet another 2 years pass, and the next console generation is getting to kick off. We're at the PS4 and Xbox One era at this time. And then finally at E3, the news is brought out to the mainstream. The Dark spin-off is coming to the next generation, and after what is admittedly one hell of a trailer, it is revealed that it is no longer a side story, and that the scope has changed, so that this is now going to be the next mainline title in the beloved franchise. And then a few months later, a third sequel came out for the 2009 game, and at that point the fanbase was just mostly confused. Final Fantasy XV eventually did release in 2016, and this was 10 years after the original announcement. The original director had stepped down at the very end of 2013, effectively giving Hajime Tabata a little over 2 years to more or less start the game over. Very little of what was shown in the original trailers remained in the final product, and the game was lightly panned, feeling largely incomplete. But finally we were in an era where the game had left vaporware status. Tabata spent the next 2 years adding changes and chapters to the game, some of which were better received than the main release, up until he ended up leaving the company in 2018. All told, the project took 12 years until it was considered complete, even though a few extra episodes were cancelled with Tabata's leaving, and here's what Square Enix had to show for all this. Millions of dollars spent, millions of dollars lost on the back end, over a decade of languishing in development hell, and that is without even discussing the full-length feature film that was made to promote the game. Seriously, it's bad. A fan base alienated, one of the studio's directors leaving, and the future of one of gaming's most storied franchises thrown into question. As of the making of this video, Final Fantasy XV has sold an estimated 9.8 million copies. Now I offer a second scenario. The exact same studio gets an opportunity to develop an action game alongside Platinum Games, a studio that's considered to be the best in their field. After some planning, a director is chosen, and in 2015, a follow-up to one of Square Enix's cult classics is announced. And then this happened.
皆様こんにちは。
Hello
ディレ
everyone.
クターの横尾です。
I'm the director of the new project, Mr. Taro Yoko.
The industry and the world were given their first mainstream introduction to Yoko Taro. Some were mesmerized, some were absolutely confused, but most importantly, people memed. And this was insanely good press, even if people weren't exactly sure what the fuck they just saw. The next year, the game was given a title and a trailer, and then in the following year, March 2017, the game was released in the US. The game was more warmly received than any of the games outlined in the first scenario, won several awards, and has developed a ravenous cult following. The game's main character has gone on to make guest appearances in other games, and there is more degenerate fan art for 2B than you can ever imagine. And even Hideki Kamiya credits this game's success with virtually saving his company. As of July 2021, Nier Automata has sold 6 million copies. And that's 6 million copies at a fraction of the cost of Final Fantasy, and definitely at a fraction of the development time. So, back to that thing that I needed help understanding. If you were in charge of a company, which one of these scenarios would be more appealing to you? Between the directors of both scenarios, which one would you hitch the long-term success of your company to? And which would you let spend the next 4 years and some change working on mobile games and remakes of their earlier works? Seriously, man, life ain't fucking fair. I am definitely biased on this one. Yoko Taro is by far and away my favorite director, and it's not even a stretch to say that he's my favorite artist. I've played everything that he has both written and directed, starting with Drakengard. I've followed his career closely since then, and I'm a huge fan, with Drakengard 3 being my personal favorite video game of all time. I know it's a wild opinion, but it's mine. Like, seriously, I've got this dude fucking tattooed on my arm. So, yeah, biased. There's something very strange that happens when it comes to being a fan of an auteur, especially in the case of video games. We all know inherently that games are a huge collaborative effort, but when one creator takes the mantle and becomes synonymous with their work, the audience begins to isolate the idiosyncratic elements in their creations and attributes them directly to their personalities. Without ever having met any of these people, I have a loose idea of who they are, quirks about their personalities, or at the very least, a vague understanding of what fuels their creative impulses. This guy is obsessed with story crafting and world building above all else, and isn't afraid to wear his influences completely on his sleeve. He almost seems to revel in being slightly derivative, but understands the medium that he works in such a way that he's able to stitch his influences together into something that always feels wholly original. He's not afraid to steal from the best, and he definitely understands his audience. This man, whether or not he means to, he just lies a lot. This guy wants to make movies, and even though he's made some amazing games, he just doesn't seem to know how to finish them anymore. And this guy is detail obsessed. He knows how to get a job done on time and on budget. He is more likely connected to the actual Yakuza. I mean, just look at him. He is sentimental and goofy, and the dude absolutely hangs out with adult film stars on the weekend. I'm probably wrong about these people, at least a little. But all of those things feel true after spending hour upon hour in the worlds that they've created. This is the trap that parasocial relationships create. And with each of these creators being the face of their projects, we not only get a sense of who they are through the various PR campaigns and interviews, but we connect with them to their work in a very visceral way. Bringing it back to Taro, there is just something about his work that speaks to me personally. Something about his ability to be so poignant one moment and then completely crass in the next. There is a bleakness to his work that just completely nails the human condition, and a love for the absurdity in people and the power structures that they live in that I just understand it. He is dark, he is goofy, he is cruel, he's a perv, and he is just a human that I am truly glad not only exists, but that he has been able to make art for all of us to experience. Prior to the release of Automata, we had Drakengard, then Nier, and then Drakengard 3. Each of these games has its own identity, but there were definitely recurrent themes across all three. Death, unreliable narrators, loss, absurdity, surrealism, pain. All of these things came through. However, each of these games always had this slightly annoying problem that faces almost every artist at one point or another in their career, and that's just potential. With Drakengard, you had a batshit insane story and a colorful cast, but you had awful combat, terrible visuals, a monotonous grind, and a soundtrack that was so grating and horrible that I kind of find it genius, and I come back to it from time to time. Nier was definitely the best of these three, but it too became a repetitive grind, especially if you're trying to see all the content. And Drakengard 3, my favorite game. It's rough, man. It runs like shit to the point where I had migraines from playing it. The frame rate often dives into single digits. The combat has potential, but because of the poor performance, you often get away with just mashing until you have enough meter to mash harder. And then there's this final boss fight, which is insane and sadistic. I mean, you're putting a rhythm game at the end of a action RPG. Seriously, miss one note while the camera's trying to shake you from view, and then there's this tricky last note. I mean, fuck. I'm not going to try and rationalize why this is my favorite game at this point. It'll come eventually. But you're just going to have to trust me that there's something here, even if I'm one of the few people who sees it. Nier Automata, however, was the first Taro game where it truly felt like all the potential had finally been realized. It is by no means a perfect game, but in some ways it feels like the perfect Yoko Taro game. Fast and fully functional combat, the gameplay is varied and seems to improve on all the little ideas that Taro has been messing around with since early on in his career. You have the top-down sections, run and gun stuff, you have breaking of the fourth wall, and lucky for Jason McElroy, the fishing is so simple in this title that anyone can understand how to do it. Even the branch structure in terms of storytelling is at its best in this game, with only the A and B branch being repetitive, and not even completely at that point. And then there's this incredible ending that just brings the whole game full circle. The human condition is better analyzed, the tone in the story is laser focused, and where his previous game, Drakengard 3, was over the top with its brutality and just crass nature, Taro seemed to come into Automata with a very subdued and measured focus. It is a beautiful game, and people noticed. As I mentioned earlier, Automata was very successful. Successful in the art of storytelling, gameplay, sales, and critical reception. And the buzz around Automata and Taro was huge. And although this was the first game written and directed by Taro to completely hit it out of the park, the entire gaming press seemed to elevate Taro's status as an auteur alongside legends like Kojima, Ueda, and Matsuno overnight. There were even multiple outlets simultaneously clamoring for Taro to be given the reins to the next mainline Final Fantasy game. But all that buzz was back in 2017. So what has Taro been up to since then? He was the creative director on 2 iOS gacha games. He wrote a scenario based on Automata for Final Fantasy XIV, and he was the creative director on a remake of the original Nier, and most recently, he was the creative director on Voice of Cards. The man has certainly been busy, but there has been a noticeable downgrade in the profile of these recent projects. Taro has stated in the past that he's just happy to be working and that he would gladly do any job as long as he's paid for it, but let's get real. How do you go from making such a hit to sliding back behind the scenes right after the biggest point in your career? Something is going on at Square Enix, and something is going on with Taro. I just wish I knew what it was. I know times have been tough, especially with the last 2 years, but it was a shock when on December 22nd, 2021, Taro, alongside series producer Yosuke Saito and Keiichi Okabe, just out of the blue declared the Nier series over. It's a strange announcement, and you should definitely go and watch it. There seems to be a tongue-in-cheek quality to the whole thing, and with Taro's history of trolling, it's kind of hard to know for sure if this is really the end, or if maybe this is an elaborate ruse to prep us for the next Nier game. But if you take it on its face value, it looks like Square Enix has been comfortable to let Yoko Taro hang out in the back and now cancel his main series. It's no secret that Square Enix has been struggling to find its contemporary identity. Flagship series have wasted away in development for decades in some cases. IPs have sat unused. Western studios have been shuttered. Games that have sold well and been received well have been called out for underperforming. Remasters of dubious quality have become the norm. Final Fantasy XIV was initially a failure and had to be burned down to the foundation before being rebuilt in its current state. And I'm glad they did, because apparently that has become Square Enix's biggest success story arguably ever. This recent success undoubtedly led to producer and director Naoki Yoshida taking on the role of producer for the upcoming Final Fantasy XVI. And then now, just on January 1st of 2022, Square Enix's president just made it clear that he hopes things like NFTs and blockchain technology become a pillar of the company's success. God damn it, Square Enix, what are you guys doing? Square Enix has become risk-averse and unfocused, grasping for whichever new trend they think will keep them in the black. And we can blame it on the pandemic, we can blame it on shareholders, or we could just even, accurately blame it on our current capitalist organization of the economy. But, who's got time for that? And then there's just the sad truth that maybe if you're in charge of a giant company and you're trying to minimize risk, you just may not have a place for this man anymore. And I don't even know if I can blame you. Even if Automata did seem to be quite profitable. But beggars can't be choosers, or whatever the hell it is they say. Yoko Taro was the creative director on Voice of Cards, and with that being his most substantial, non-mobile new project that he's worked on since Automata, and I'm a huge fan, so of course I was going to play it. Voice of Cards, The Isle Dragon Roars, came out late last year and was released on PlayStation 4, Switch, and PC. All I knew about the game before playing it was that Taro was involved, and apparently it was a card-based RPG. In my mind, I had imagined a deck-building game like Slay the Spire, or even an old-school one like Batten Kaitos, but immediately upon booting it up and hearing the narrator, it became apparent that I was playing a RPG based on D&D or other tabletop games.
Good afternoon, or should I say evening, morning. Morning? At any rate, I'm the Game Master. Pleased to make your acquaintance.
The tutorial has you playing as a trio of adventurers tasked with retrieving a treasure from a dark cave, crawling with monsters, and after moving across a few titles, the game puts you in battle. So this is pretty straightforward stuff. Right away, the system becomes apparent. Your characters attack in order of speed stat, and the cards, they operate as nothing more than an artistic menu choice. Each skill has an assigned cost that is denoted by how many energy crystals you have in the top left of your screen. In battle, in this game, it became obvious that the card motif was taking a backseat, as they are just usually being used as a menu, portrait, and tile set substitute. But other than the fact that I found it confusing for a game with cards in the title, I did find it to be a cool art style, and it's completely serviceable for what they're doing. The tutorial serves as something as a bait and switch. It shows what this game could be if it was taken on just a surface level, a safe and almost paint-by-numbers take on a generic tabletop RPG. The three characters that you play as in the tutorial are as traditional of a party composition as humanly possible, with as much character as a Final Fantasy I party, really. But thankfully, this is done as a subtle way of lowering expectations. However, after the reveal, you find that while your main characters are much less vanilla than the tutorial trio, they are pretty paint-by-numbers when compared to more roguish protagonists of something like Final Fantasy IX, and absolutely bland in comparison to characters from other Taro games. We have the snarky sellsword and his traveling companion, Mar, a monster that seemingly only the protagonist can understand, and right away I couldn't help but compare these characters to another set of characters from Taro's back catalog. And that was the young protagonist and Emil from Nier Replicant. This is not a carbon copy, but the only slightly edgy protagonist who will do any job for money definitely reminded me of the young boy running errands for everyone over town. And with the game immediately showing that the townsfolk are disapproving of even Mar's existence, it definitely reminded me of how Emil was treated in his game. After the briefest of introductions to this duo, the game makes its main objective known. You are tasked by the Queen of the Realm with killing a dragon. Simple enough, no real comment there, other than maybe it's a little straightforward. We are then introduced to a third-party member, a mage with a short temper and a disdain for monsters, and after attacking the duo, she ends up joining up in hopes of tracking the dragon down with you. Her quick temper and constant bickering does call Kaine from Nier into mind, but only mildly, and in no way nearly as interesting. And shortly after that, it's revealed that the tutorial trio is quite a big deal in the realm, and they become something of a rival group for you to face. And they're also just rude and quick to violence too. Out of this early iteration of the cast, there isn't much that truly stands out on its own, and it is hard to know how much of this is a fault of this game or how much of it comes down to my own internal comparisons to what I've come to expect from Taro. Some of this clearly comes down to budget limitations, but to give credit where credit is due, every bit of design in this game obviously is a creative solution to this limitation. The art design, it's good, but it's obviously cheap. The animations, same thing there. And even the boss fights and ultimate attacks somehow manage to be interesting when it's being done with the same card motif. From a characterization standpoint, having the narrator not only narrate the campaign, but he also voices every character.
Seated upon the throne, the queen faces the crowd. Her lips part. Thank you all for heeding my call to slay the dragon.
Todd Haberkorn really does one hell of a job and always seems to bring the right tone to every scene, which is not surprising considering the shocking amount of roles that he has held. But that being said, again, it is hard to compare this to Taro's previous works. Taro is a great writer, he is a great storyteller, but above all else, he is an amazing cutscene director. So many of his games are punching above their design weight when you see what he does with this direction, and that is sorely missed in this game. It is charming to see pixel characters emote in sprite-based games, and that same charm does carry over in this game whenever you watch the static portraits on screen bounce and shrink around whenever they're trying to be expressive, but it could never compare to something like this.
Holy shit.
I've been alluding to this, and maybe not even that well, I'm pretty transparent, but I can't hold it back anymore. The biggest letdown about this game has very little to do with its own quality, but instead how much of a dip it is considering who's making it. But in the interest of being fair, what is this game's identity outside of comparing it to Taro's better works? The combat is fine, and in some ways it's strategically interesting. This is a nice take on turn-based combat, and even with the art style being what it is, I already mentioned, but some of the super attacks and critical hits that can occur are impressive considering the medium. Status effects are tactically interesting too, as they can stop enemies from attacking, which is admittedly nothing new, but since all skills from all team members drain the same resource in the top left corner, there are situations where you have to work around this. Shock or freeze an enemy so you can skip a turn or two in order to release a highly damaging skill from somebody waiting in the wings. From beginning to mid-game, the skills are varied, and there's room for a little experimentation that I found decently satisfying. The only problem with this is that once you get towards the back half of the game, all that experimentation just leads you to one team and one skill set that is so much better than anything else that there's just no reason to go back. And with this being the kind of game where team members on the bench gain passive experience, what little artificial reason there could have been to experiment, that's also been disincentivized. The only thing about the gameplay that I can call a complete failure, though, is the actual card game that was built into this game as a side activity. It's clunky, slow, and depends far too much on luck and RNG to be interesting. And there's little reason to do it more than a few times, as there are no real rewards tied to this activity. I found it pretty alarming at the beginning of my playthrough. I thought this was going to be a card game throughout, and really when it did come down to having a fully implemented card game, I wish they hadn't. The overall presentation is charming. As I mentioned before, the narrator is great. The character portraits and design are memorable, even if the townsfolk and some of the cast slide into the generic side of fantasy tropes. But really, the card aesthetic, as good as it is, it can be limiting. Everything in this game is represented by cards, whether it be a mountain, a dragon, or a person. There is a tile set for that, and while none of these look bad, and in some cases look real good, your mileage about how interesting you find this world is going to vary by how much your imagination can fill in the gaps. And then there's the story. In true Taro fashion, things aren't always what they seem, and there are some pretty good twists considering how straightforward the game starts off. However, all the twists, characters, and themes do end up feeling like fairly well-tread ground for a game with his involvement. So if I were to remove his name from the tin and just compare the plot with other RPGs, this is good stuff. The flavor text for events in particular is fun and quirky, and I especially enjoyed the running joke of having every innkeeper in every town having a unique excuse for letting your party stay for free.
The innkeeper gives you a room free of charge in a show of support for any and all who wish to defeat the dragon. You've clearly been mistaken for someone else, but the innkeeper looks so excited that you dare not burst her bubble. Your room is free.
The soundtrack is great. I mean, really, Keiichi Okabe could never really disappoint. But there is so little of it. This is a short game after all. It's only around 10 hours long. But even then, a lot of these tunes, they repeat throughout the entire game. I already mentioned how I felt about the characters and all of the themes that I've come to expect from my favorite artist, and they're all present, but ultimately muted. This could have to do with the fact that Taro has taken on the role of creative director instead of his normal role of writer-director, but ultimately this game and the writing, it just has all sorts of touches that point to his direct involvement. The writing is snarky, the way that the game wraps up is completely in his wheelhouse. Side characters and side missions are clearly influenced by things he's written in the past. The soundtrack would be at home in his other games, and all the design choices, while simple, are fully functional. This is a good game. It's a good RPG, and I would go as far as to say it's a bit unique. It's just one of the weaker games to have his involvement. And given Square Enix's track record, I can't even point to this as a failure of anyone directly involved in this game, but more as a misallocation of resources. The whole time I was playing this, I could imagine an exec coming into a boardroom saying, "We have a little money left over for this quarter, and we just need something quick and dirty. Hey Taro, can you make us a game for dirt cheap?" And if something like that were to have happened, then I guess this game is a success. It's just such a misuse of talent. If this game were to be made by a plucky new upstart, I would be genuinely impressed. I would actually be excited for whatever the team did next. But because of who is involved, it is just serviceable, and all it has really done is make me more certain that I no longer trust Square Enix like I once did. If you are a RPG fan and you're looking for something short or just something visually interesting, then I recommend it. If you are looking for a good story and some fun writing, this game has that too. By all accounts, I give this a soft recommendation, especially if you can get it for cheap. But if you're just picking it up because you're excited about the next Taro game, then welcome to the club and I'm happy to have you. But maybe this isn't his best. Let's just hope we don't have to wait too long until Square Enix gets with the fucking program.